Okay, I want to talk today about a seasonal topic. I want to talk about Moshe Rabeinu's yahrzeit. The Mechaber in Siman Taf Kuf Pei, in the Siman about Tainis Tzadikim, brings a whole list. We've touched on this list before of different additional Tanaisim that a person could or should fast. He starts with Elo Hayamim She'eru Behem Tzaras Lavesenu. These are days that tzaras happened to our forefathers. V'roi L'sanis Behem. It's worthy for someone to fast on them. Then he continues, he brings a list, Be'achad B'Nisan, etc. And then he gets to the end of the Sif, in the end of Sif Beis, he says, B'Shiva Ba'adar Meis Moshe Rabeinu Olav HaShalom. On the 7th day of Adar, Moshe Rabeinu was nifter, and because of that, it's a fast day for people to have on the 7th day of Adar. Now, I want to talk about this Misas Moshe Rabeinu, but let's just start from the more bakanto basic details of it, and then we'll move on to some of the more obscure and more interesting details about the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabeinu. So, Kaidem Kol, the Gemara in Kedushin on the Flamet Chesam and Aleph, the Gemara brings down as follows. The Gemara says, B'Shiva Ba'adar Meis Moshe, B'Shiva Ba'adar Noilad. On the 7th day of Adar, Moshe Rabeinu was nifter, and on the 7th day of Adar, Moshe Rabeinu was born. Then the Gemara continues and brings psukim to explain to us how we know this. It says, B'Shiva Ba'adar Meis Shenemar Vayamas Shel Moshe Eved Hashem, Yiksiv Vayivku Beis Yisrael Moshe Ba'arvis Moav, Shloshim Yom, and the Gemara continues, and the Gemara makes a cheshbon based on the psukim about when Klal Yisrael went into Eretz Yisrael, and the amount of time that the Avelis period and of Moshe Rabbeinu was, to extrapolate for us that the day that Moshe Rabbeinu must have been niftar on was Zayin Ba'adar. Then the Gemara continues on, and the Gemara says, how do we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was born on Zayin Adar? Gemara brings psukim for that. Shenemar vayomer aleim ben mei v'asim shana neich hayom leuchal ad latzis v'lavei shein tamalim hayom al tamalim hayom melamed. And here's the punchline: Shakadosh Baruch Hu yoshev u'memalish neiseim shel tzadikim miyom liyom u'michodesh l'chodesh. Hashem sits and is memala the days of a tzaddik miyom liyom u'michodesh l'chodesh. So Moshe Rabbeinu had a complete life, a life that spanned from Zayin Adar to Zayin Adar, 120 years. Now, the Gemara elsewhere analyzes some more interesting details about the story of Moshe Rabbeinu's death, and based on that is how many different minhagim of the Yom Zayin Adar come to be. Now I'll explain what I mean. The Gemara in Saita, in the end of the first parak, the Gemara elaborates on the kfura of Moshe Rabbeinu. The pasuk says that Hashem buried Moshe Rabbeinu, vayikaver oisai bagay be'eretz Moav mul beis pa'ar. Hashem buried Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Torah tells us where Hashem buried Moshe Rabbeinu, but and Afal Pikein, the pasuk continues and it says, "V'layada ishes kfurasai." Nobody knew where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried. Now Hakadosh Baruch Hu wanted it so that no one should know where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried, and Hakadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaydev atzmai buried Moshe Rabbeinu. Now the Gemara tells a story over here. The Kvar Sholcha Malchus HaRisha. We know that at some point, an enemy government sent a troop of soldiers to try to look for Moshe Rabbeinu's kever. So they went to Beis Pa'ar and they said, Hareinu Hechen Moshe Kaver, show us where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried. So Amdu L'mayla, if they stood on the top of the peak, on top of the mountain to try to spot Moshe Rabbeinu's kever, it appeared to them like the kever was down below. They went to the bottom to look for the kever, it appeared to them the kever was up above. So they split up the troop and they said, in the Chalkul Shlei Kitas, let's split up into two groups. So then what happened, says the Gemara, Oisin Sha'imdim L'mayla, Nidma Lahem Lamata. Those who were standing on the top, it appeared to them like Moshe Rabbeinu was buried on the bottom. And Lamata Nidma Lahem Lamayla. Those who were standing on the bottom, it appeared to them that Moshe Rabbeinu was buried on the top. L'kayim Mashanemet, to be Mekayim, the pasuk that Hakadosh Baruch Hu says in the end of the Torah, V'layada ishes kfurasei. Nobody knows where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried. So the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says, we learn from here how big Gemilas Chesed is. Shekaviyachal Hakadosh Baruch Hu himself was oisik in Gemilas Chesed to bury Moshe Rabbeinu and put him in this ma'ara that was unfindable. So we have two nekudas so far that we established from the Gemara. We know first of all when Moshe Rabbeinu's yahrzeit is. We know that it's on Zayin Adar. We know three nekudas, I guess, and we know who the Chaver Kadisha was that buried Moshe Rabbeinu. We know the Chaver Kadisha is Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and we also know that Moshe Rabbeinu is an unfindable grave. It's a grave that nobody is able to find. We don't know where it is. Now there's another fourth interessante nekuda about the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died, and that is as follows. It's a unique feature. The last 8 psukim of the Torah and the end of Devarim are the story of Moshe Rabbeinu's death and the burial of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Mirveisenach, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who came down from Har Sinai with the Torah and wrote the Torah. So it's interessant in Akuda that Moshe Rabbeinu was writing down the details of his own death before they take place. Because the pasuk, the last 8 psukim of the Torah, ends off Vayamas Moshe Eved Hashem. Then it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu buried him. Then it says Klal Yisrael was boicha and mesavel on him. So Moshe Rabbeinu is, so to speak, charting the own story of his death. In the Chassidish Welt, sometimes you'll see there's svarim that chart out the last year, months, weeks of a Gracie Rebbe's histalkus, because during the Zman of histalkus is a great time of sharing wisdom, of passing on the torch to the next generation. Marshall, I think I have one Seder Shana Achrona from the Minchas Elazar's life. It was published in Munkach still before the war, a description of the Minchas Elazar's Seif Yamav. So Lahavdil, in the Torah Alein, Moshe Rabbeinu's Seif Yamav is described in these last 8 psukim. So the Gemara Menachos on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph brings down a machlekes what the status of these 8 psukim, these last 8 psukim in the Torah that are describing Moshe Rabbeinu's death is. So Amar of Gidol Amar Rav Shmoyne psukim shebeTorah Yachad Kairos and Beis HaKnesses the Like Reb Shimon. Because here's the machlekes. The Tanya we learned, it says in the Torah Vayamos Sham Moshe Eved Hashem. So Reb Shimon said, Efshar Moshe Chai, could it be that Moshe is alive because of Vayamos Sham Moshe? How could Moshe Rabbeinu be alive and well and be writing in the Sefer Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu is deceased, he's dying? El Ad Kan Kasav Moshe, until these 8 psukim is the psukim that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote himself. Mikan Ve'elach Kasav Yeshua ben Nun. The last 8 psukim of the Torah, the author is not Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Yeshua ben Nun. That's Rabbi Yehuda Shita. V'amil Rav Nechemya. Amil Rav Shimon, Efshar Sefer Torah Chaser Isachas, V'ksiv L'kuach Sefer Torah Zeh, V'samtem Oisei, Ela Ad Kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu Oimer U'Moshe Kaisev. Until here HaKadosh Baruch Hu was dictating and Moshe Rabbeinu was writing Hashem's word. Mikan Ve'elach, from these 8 psukim and on, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Oimer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was dictating U'Moshe Kaisev B'dema. Moshe was writing it B'dema, which Pashtus means in tears. So we have a machlokes in the Gemara in Menachos and the Flamed. If these last 8 psukim of the Torah that describe the death of Moshe Rabeinu are written by Moshe Rabeinu himself or written by Yeshua. Nastam, interessante Nakuda, the Gemara over here brings a machlokes who wrote those last 8 psukim. In the Zohar HaKadosh, in Parshas Devarim, in the end of Sefer Devarim, in the Zohar HaKadosh, the Zohar says that Moshe Rabbeinu was nifter on this day, leaving those 8 psukim incomplete, because one can't write B'chayei Chiyusei about his death. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Mechayim Mesim, brought Moshe Rabbeinu back to life to transcribe into the end of the Torah in these 8 psukim the story of his death. And then Moshe Rabbeinu was nifter again. And he says, L'kayim Mashenemar, Torah Hashem Temima, Meshivas Nafesh. The Torah of Hashem is complete because Meshivas Nafesh, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Tchias HaMesim to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why he was able to be able to write the last 8 words, 8 letters, 8 psukim of the Torah on his own, which is a fascinating idea. It's not what this Gemara holds, but it is what the Zohar says. Now, so this is another component, and this is actually the component that leads to a lot of tumult about Moshe Rabbeinu Sefer Torah, the Din and Dinei Safras, etc. But we'll leave it at that. That's the Gemaras that describe the P'tir of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, so let's talk about a few Nakudas, outcroppings that come from these unique features of Moshe Rabbeinu's Misa. Now, for starters, something that's unique about Moshe Rabbeinu's Kvura is that it's unknown. We don't know where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried, so we're missing details. We don't have a kever to go to Moshe Rabbeinu and to daven by Moshe Rabbeinu's kever. Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem hid him away so that Klal Yisrael shouldn't be able to daven there and force results that Hashem doesn't want. Now, there's an interesting shaila in the sugi of yard sites that comes up that's related to this, and I'll explain. The Shulchan Aruch in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tav Kuf Samaches brings as follows. The minig is, and this is an Ashkenazi minig, that on the yom of a person's father or mother's yard site, he's supposed to fast. The person's supposed to fast on the day of the yard site of the father. Now, what happens if a person is unaware exactly what the date of the death of the father is? Now, there's many shilos that could come up with this, but the Magen Avraham brings down from a Marshal that says as follows: if a person doesn't know when the yard site of a parent is and he wants to be kaveh a yard site, so the Marshal says a person could choose any day that he wants, and from now on that will be the yard site day, with all the dinim of yard site attached to that day. But says the Marshal, davar shebechayva ene bamen ahektish. There's a din that a davar shebechayva, a carbon that you're obligated to bring, you can't bring from Meiser Sheni, let's say. You can't bring from something that's hektish already. So says the Marshal, davar shebechayva, a tinus of a yahrzeit, which is a chayv, a person is obligated to fast on the yahrzeit of his father, any bum in a hektish. So one has to be careful not to select a day that he's already mechuyev to fast anyway. You have to select a clean day. That's what the Marshal says, and others argue, and there's many machlekes in the Poskim about this inyan. Now, where did the shaila become very relevant on a large scale? Was Leilenu after the Holocaust, when many people did not know exactly what day, even what month, or even what year a parent or a close relative was killed during the Holocaust. And the shaila arose, when to be kaveh a yahrzeit? How and when are you kaveh a yahrzeit when you have no way of knowing? Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the sugis of agunis became very relevant to this shaila, because one of the primary deciding factors in the sugi of agunis is when the cheskas chai goes away. When is a person no longer assumed to be alive? And when the cheskas chai is batal, then you could assume the person to be dead. So many of the person can behandle the chazak of cheskas chai, and depending on different points of the war, when do we assume, like, what was the efficiency rate? What was the efficiency rate of the Nazis at that point of the war, and therefore to know, to what end, to how much of a cheskas chai there would be. Now, so the Minchas Yitzchak in Chelik Aleph in Tshuva Pei Gimel, he has a tshuva about this, where someone asks him that I'm not aware of when the yahrzeit for my fathers should be from the Holocaust, and I'd like to know when to be kaveh the yahrzeit. So he starts off with rather an interesting nakuda, and this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's worth sharing. He starts off by handling, first of all, mechatesa, that someone who's killed during the Holocaust, someone who's killed al Kiddush Hashem as a Kaddish, should even need Kaddish, should even need the idea of the yahrzeit. So he behandles, there's really two reasons why yahrzeits are established, and based on the chiluk of these two reasons, it would break down if one even needs a yahrzeit for someone who's a Kaddish, someone who was killed during the Holocaust. And I'll share it because it's interesting. The Gemara in Masechtas Kala Rabsi, in the end of Parak Beis, towards the end of Parak Beis, brings a fascinating story with Rabbi Akiva. It says Rabbi Akiva was once traveling to a certain location, and he came across a person, a being, who was schlepping wood up and down a hill, working very hard. And Rabbi Akiva was able to understand and be able to tell by looking at this person that this is not a person who's from this world anymore. This is a person who's already went to the next world. And the fact that he's down here and slaving away in this manner and carrying the wood from here to there is clearly a chelik of his einish. It's a chelik of his gehenna. So Rabbi Akiva stops him, and Rabbi Akiva says, what's your story? What's your deal? So the guy says, yeah, I was a bad guy, and this is my punishment. So Amalei Rabbi Akiva, Shavkis bra, did you leave over a child behind? Amalei, he says, the guy says, I can't talk to you. If I slouch on the job, the malachim come and they give me makis. The guy was afraid to talk to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, no, just tell me if you left over sons. He says, I don't know. Shavkis itzitzama barta. I left over a pregnant wife. I have no idea if I have a son. I don't even know what happened. So Azur Rabbi Akiva, Allahu Medinasa. He went to that area, to that location that this person said that he stams from. And he told the people in the city, I'm looking for this fellow's almana. Amalei, they told him, Ya'akar zichrei dehu. Ya'akar zichrei. His remembrance, his zecher should be uprooted. He was a terrible guy. He used to steal, and he killed people, and he was a terrible person, and we don't want to have anything to do with him. So Rekiva says, Afal Pikin, show me where his wife is. So he finds the wife, and he finds that she had given birth to a son. So he finds it. So actually, the Kala Rapsi, there's two different girsayis. One from the Medrash is a little different. The Kala Rapsi says, Azul Lebeisa, he went to the house. Shtakach Itzasa, he found a woman, Morbarta, who was still pregnant. Natra, he waited at the Yelda until she gave birth. Azul Mahale, he gave this child of this bad person a bris. Lechigadol, when the kid got a little older, Okme Bebe Knishta, he put him in the Beis HaKneshtes. He says, Lebruche Bekahala, to make brachas in the kahal. Now, the Kala Rapsi is a little bit cryptic, but there's a medrash that's very similar, where the medrash says as follows. It says a little bit of an additional detail. It says that Rabbi Akiva went, he salvaged this child from this village. He brings this child to yeshiva. The child had the genes, and I guess the zitzfleish of his father, the big Rasha, and was not shaykh to learning b'chal. He was getting nowhere. So it says that Rabbi Akiva davened that this child should be able to be successful in learning. So it says a baskel comes out and asks Rabbi Akiva, this is what you want to waste yischosim on this child who comes from this terrible tree, is one where you want to expend yischosim? Akiva says, yeah, this is what I want to do. So it says he davened, and the child's head was opened until the child was able to learn, and he taught him aleph beis, he taught him etc. until finally he was able to take him, and the child said, Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMavorach in shul. Now from this, the Paiskim learn the idea, this is the Makar, the Paiskim bring, that a son of a deceased person says Kaddish, and by saying Kaddish, by being Mavarach es Hashem B'Rabim, by causing the Kiddush Shem Shemayim of saying Kaddish in the shul, that brings a schos to his father. So says the Minchas Yitzchak, if this is the time for Kaddish from this Kal Rabsi, which is the time that a lot of the Paiskim bring down, then l'chayr, for someone who was killed in the war, who's a Kaddish, who's in a Mechitzas and Gan Eden that we'll never be able to see, and as I get paskint in the Rambam Taka that someone who's a Harag, a Kiddush Shem Shemayim, is in Mechitzas and Gan Eden that we'll never be able to touch, so he doesn't need our Kaddish. There's no reason to say Kaddish on him. But, says the Minchas Yitzchak, there is another tam that's brought down in the Paiskim, and this, I believe, comes from a Zayar, that says that on the day a person's father was nifter, is a day of shvacha mazel. It's a day that a person himself has bad mazel, and therefore, as a schos for ourselves, as a person's schos for himself, to prevent anything bad from befalling him, on the day of his father's yahrzeit, a person is supposed to say Kaddish. So says the Minchas Yitzchak, if it's the second reason, because we're afraid it's a day of bad mazel, then of course, even on people who were killed in the war, it shouldn't be relevant and one needs to say Kaddish. And Lamaisi says, and this is a bit of a controversial detail, and many articles in Sarim have been written about this, it's not so clear that someone who wasn't killed, he wasn't killed because he stood up and said, I'm going to do mitzvahs no matter what. He wasn't killed because he was a Shomer Torah mitzvahs. He was killed because genetically he's Jewish. Possibly that person doesn't have the same level of a Kaddish that we're describing, and would maybe need a Kaddish also. Maybe at a later date we'll do a shtickle on that. It's some interesting fight. If the Harugim from the Holocaust and Harugim from terrorist attacks and etc. have the actual status of a Kaddish. But B'chalaifin, the Minchas Yitzchak continues, and he says that there's reason to establish a Yartzeit in Kaddish. He says, but L'maisa, we don't know when it could be. So he gives a few suggestions, and some seif, he ends up saying that one could choose any day they want. He handles if it could be Rosh Chodesh, could it be a day the any after fast, and the tshuva goes on. But that is the halachic background of this shaila. Now, L'maisa, every person, every kehila did their own way. For many kehilas, they decided to celebrate. They established the tainis, the yahrzeit and the kaddish the day that the trains left. Or every kehila has their own way of going about it. And b'chalif in each kehila paskin the way they paskin. I did come across an interesting idea. I found a speech from the Imrei Chaim of Vizhnitz that was given in 1962 in the Beis Medrash of Vizhnitz in Bnei Brak, where he says as follows: the tochnit of what they were doing that day was they were writing a Sefer Torah klali ilu nishmas the haruge hashalat, in remembrance of the people who were killed during the Holocaust. Now, what spurred this Sefer Torah? In his little drasha, it's about a page long. It's in Yiddish, so I'm not even going to try to read it. But the Imrei Chaim says that it was at the time when the German government had just started paying reparations and was giving money to the state of Israel. Said the Imrei Chaim, this money is blood money. They want us to forget the people who have no zecher, the people who have no one remembering them, and it's incumbent on us that we should remember people who have no zecher. And the best way to remember these people who have no zecher, who we don't even know when they died and where they were buried and where they are and what happened to them, is to write a Sefer Torah that has nitzchias, and a Sefer Torah that's going to carry these people's name and these schos forever. Now, incidentally, the day that the Imrei Chaim chose to launch this campaign, the day that they felt was the day to bring this to light, this idea that the people who have no remembrance deserve to be remembered also, is none other than the day of Zayin Adar. It's called the Zayin Adar of Adar Beis in 1962, which according to many poskim is the day that we celebrate Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrzeit when there's two others. It's a grace of machlekes poskim, but some sefer paskins like that and others paskin like that. And when there's two others, the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrzeit is Adar Beis. But on this day, says the Imrei Chaim, on the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrzeit, a day when Kilu, the first person who was buried without any place to go daven by him, without anybody being able to visit him and mark his Yahrzeit, because we don't know where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried, is the day to remember all these people who for them we don't have a place to go and we don't have a remembrance for them, and to mark it with the Sefer Torah. So the element of unknown that exists in the Kvura of Moshe Rabbeinu, the element of Moshe Rabbeinu being buried somewhere unknown, was channeled into this idea for the people who were killed by the Holocaust, who we don't know when to mark their yahrzeit or where they are or how to celebrate or how to talk about them b'chlal, is on Zayin Adar. But now this idea came even more to fruition in a different way in the secular Israeli government, in the IDF, and I'll explain how. I read this in Rabbi Goren's autobiography. It's a fascinating story I even have a hard time believing all the details are true, but I'll tell you what he says. He writes as follows. He was the first, Rabbi Goren was the first, before he became chief rabbi of Israel, he was the first chief rabbi of the Tzahal for the army. Now, he writes that in 1948, during the War for Independence, there was a terrible, terrible mission that happened when some soldiers went to Egypt. There was a troop of soldiers that was based out of Gaza, and they made an attack on this. It included an entire platoon of Frum soldiers, 86 soldiers from a platoon that was based out of Bnei Brak and Tel Aviv, which back then was very Frum. And these were Frum soldiers who were based in Gaza. And on the second night of Hanukkah, they were sent out onto a mission to attack an Egyptian town. And it was a rainy, cold night. They left. He says they lit candles in the mess hall, and then they went out for the attack. And that was the last anybody heard of them. Not a single man on that mission made it back to base. Now, this made a tremendous tumult in Eretz Yisrael, and I'll tell you why. Because some of the soldiers in this platoon had a shtickle back history. There was a tzeves of cooks in the IDF, in the beginning of the War of Independence, and at some point they staged a protest, and they said they refused to cook on Shabbos. They didn't want to have to be forced to cook on Shabbos. Now, Ben Gurion was infuriated by this, and he transferred several of those cooks, those Frum cooks who protested, to this unit that was stationed on the border with Gaza, with Egypt, where they were involved in heavy battle. And when this platoon of soldiers went missing in the dead of night on the second night of Hanukkah, some of the parents of these soldiers went on to national television in Eretz Yisrael, and they said that obviously, as an act of retribution, because these soldiers protested for Shmir Shabbos in the army, they were transferred to a frontline, position, which was cannon fodder, and they were sent out onto a suicide mission in the dead of the night to be killed for protesting. Now, this ignited a storm for obvious reasons, and Ben Gurion contacted Rabbi Goren and asked him to investigate the story and to try to find the bodies of these 86 soldiers who were missing, who were MIA, missing in action. Now, he writes a fascinating story. So it was at a lull. They established through international mediaries that he was going to be able to cross into the Egyptian side and try to find the bodies. Now, the person who was his driver on this trip was none other than Lieutenant Gamal Abdel Nasser, who ends up becoming the president of Egypt and fights many other wars with Israel over the 60s. But at that time, he was a colonel in the army, and he says he met Goren at the no man's land. He picked him up in the jeep, and Rabbi Goren writes that he was like zigzagging through the no man's land to try to get to the Egyptian side. And Rabbi Goren asked him, what's the zigzagging that's going on over here? So he says, listen, this is no man's land. You guys put mines here. We put mines here. I have no idea where they are. The best I can do is zigzag and hope I avoid them. So Rabbi Goren says, I told him that the most direct way to get from one place to another place is to go in a straight line. Any zigzag is just adding travel time to our trip. We're more likely to hit on a landmine. He says, Nasser looked at me and he said, yeah, this might explain our difference of opinion. You guys think like that, we think like this, we don't think alike. So he says he traveled with him, and Nasser brought him to a mass grave, and he showed him where all the bodies were. He says he wasn't able to establish 86 bodies, but he found, the bulk of them, and he was able to bring them to Kfuras Yisrael. Now, he did interviews with the Egyptian army to find out about the battle, and it seems what happened is that the soldiers hadn't been aware that reinforcements had just hit there, and they were outgunned, and it was a rainy night, and the Israeli soldiers with guns weren't working, and they didn't really stand a chance, and they all got massacred. So he reported back to Ben Gurion that there's no foul play, and these soldiers were not sent as an act of vengeance to die for nothing, and he was able to bring them to Kfar Yisrael, and that was very important to him. Now this became one of his main tafkidim, his main jobs in the army throughout the War of Independence, was going to battlefields later on and trying to locate the lost bodies of soldiers who were out there who were never picked up. Now, so he finds, he has chapter after chapter of him finding these bodies, and a lot of it involves crazy hoops to jump through with the different armies that he's meeting and the countries and the no man's land. He even at some point is unsure what valley, what ravine to find them in. He makes a Geirul Hagra to try to help him. It's a fascinating read. It's too long to say over in all the details, but it's a fascinating story. And at some Saif, he gets to a place. There was a battle at Latrun. I believe it's a famous tank battle in the IDF's history, the Battle of Latrun, where they were trying to scale a hill to fight the Jordanians, go up a hill, and it was again a snowy night, and they failed miserably, and 156 soldiers were dead and left on the hillside over there. Now, the Israelis ended up losing that whole area, and it becomes Jordanian territory. Afterwards, when there's a ceasefire, he gets permission to go in, and it's a ganze sichsuch to find these bodies. They had been washed down into a ravine off the hill, like all in the mud, and he had to collect them. Say if he comes back with a tremendous amount of bodies, but since they were all washed down the hill, it's a mix between Arabs and Jews. It's hard to know who's who. So he writes over here, he went to the Chazon Ish, because the din in Shulchan Aruch is that it's Asher Likvar Rasha Eitzel Tzadik. You're not allowed to bury a Rasha and a Tzadik together. So he says, how could I take a soldier who was Nerag al Kiddush Hashem and bury him near an Arab who was fighting him? How could I do that? So he went to the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish told him that he should make a t'nai while he's doing the burials, and he should say, anybody who's Jewish, I'm burying over here, and anybody who's not is ka'afar da'ar. It's just more sand and dust that I'm burying together. So I'm not burying Tzadik Eitzel Rasha, but extensive. Now, the problem that arose is that of these many bodies that he was finding, lots of them were b'chlal unknown. They had no idea who was even serving in the army. It was such a frantic environment when people were coming. They were literally taking young men off the boats in Haifa and Yaffo and wherever they were landing, refugees, and literally dumping them straight into army units that were on the front line, tank battalions and infantry battalions, just dumping them off. So a lot of these bodies were in ganzen unknown. Nobody knew who they were, what they were, when they were died, who their family is. And it was a shver maisa to bury them just as unknown entities. No one will ever know who they are again. So the rabbinate of the IDF came up with a wonderful idea, and this is a holiday that's celebrated in Israel till today. There's a ceremony every year at Har Herzl where the soldiers are buried, that on the day of Zayin Adar, on the day of Moshe Rabeinu's Yartzeit, they gather together and they make a ceremony. Why? Says Ergorin, in theory, Moshe Rabbeinu was the first MIA. He's the first person who was buried, but we don't know where he's buried. We don't know anything about the details of his kfura. So, yeah, it's a stretch. It's not exactly the same. But this is the same idea that the Emrei Chaim was expressing, is actually an active IDF holiday to be masker these people who we have no idea who they were, but they died fighting, is musker. They do it on Zayin Adar, because that's the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's an unknown grave for people who are buried with ignominy, people who were never known. It's a interesting use, so to speak, of this characteristic of Moshe Rabbeinu's Petira. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but there's one more nekuda that I want to touch. The second important nekuda, and this is maybe a little more famous, is that the Chevra Kadisha arrangement for Moshe Rabbeinu was a little bit unique, because we don't have anybody else that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself is the Chevra Kadisha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alein is the Chevra Kadisha. So, because of this, the Yom of Zayin Adar in many Kehilas throughout Europe was nikva as the day of the Chevra Kadisha. Now, this is not exclusive to Zayin Adar. If you look in the Nittei Gavril and Avelis in the back of Chelik Beis, he compiles a somewhat comprehensive list of all different Kehilas and what the Yom of the Chevra Kadisha is, and there are plenty of other days. It's not Dafka Zayin Adar, but the overwhelming majority of Kehilas, the Yom of the Chevra Kadisha, to do their tefillas and their sidra, is the day of Zayin Adar. Now, so let's talk about why, and let's talk about what's included in this. So now, why is a few different, interpretations as to why. So the Pashut reason is that the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alein was Isaac in the Gemilas Chasadim of Chevra Kadisha, this is the day that shows the highest value and the privilege, the value, and the chaymer, I guess, of what the Chevra Kadisha is engaged in. And because of that, it's the day to celebrate their work, where they fast, and they daven, they say special slichas. In a lot of kilos, there's a special suda. Maybe we'll talk about some of the details. So because Hashem himself was Isaac in Chevra Kadisha work, like the Gemara in Sotah says that we showed, so this is a day that the Chevra Kadisha chooses to celebrate their personal holiday. Now, incidentally, there's another interessante reason that's given that people say, is that if you think about it, in every business that a person could run, a good day is a day that's busy, and a bad day is a day that's quiet. Because when it's quiet, it means you're not having any business. A busy day, yeah, it's hard, but that's when business is getting done. They say there's only one type of business where a quiet day is good and a busy day is bad. That's if your business is Chevra Kadisha. A quiet day, no one dies, that's a good day. A busy day, that's a terrible day. That means there's a lot of burials to have. So the day that Zayin Adar is the day that the Chevra Kadisha got a break. The Chaver Kadisha wasn't busy because HaKadosh Baruch Hu became the Chaver Kadisha that day. So to show that the Malachas HaKadosh that they're involved in is a Malacha that they hoped they didn't have to be. It's something they wished was quiet, not noisy. They celebrate on this day of Zayin Adar. It's Al Derech Remez. I don't know if that's really the reason, but it's an interesting reason. But in any case, so the basic tzura of the minig is that they fast, and they say special tefillah, special slichas that they say on that day, and then at the end of the day, they have a suda that they make. Now I just want to read the Gesher Achayim in his Sefer on Hilchos Avelus. So he brings down a pretty descriptive description of what the minig was in Yerushalayim Al Kapanim, and that could be something that could give us an idea of what this minig is in many different kilas. He says, "Upayir HaKodesh Yerushalayim Yom HaChever Kadisha Zayin Adar." The day that the Chever Kadisha does the Chever Kadisha holiday is Zayin Adar. Yom Histalkus Moshe Rabeinu Olav Shalom. The day that Moshe Rabeinu was nostalgic. Yom Zeh Misanin Kol Chever Kadisha. Everyone fasts. Mekablan Atainas, he says, the Mincha Shalafanav, Mincha from the day before Babayker. Mispal and Yachtov Kol HaChaverim. The Beis HaKnesses HaMiyuchad Lahem. They daven in the Beis HaKnesses that's Miyuchad for them. After Chazaras Hashatz, Omer Maslichas HaMiyuchadim Liyom Zeh. They say the Slichas that's special for this day. The Kairim Vayichal. They read Vayichal. Gam B'Tfilah Shachris. Then after the Tfilah, Holchum Kol Chever HaKadisha V'Hagabayim V'Roshei Adgalim LeBeis HaAlman. They go to the Beis HaKvaros, which in his time meant Har Zeisim. Sham Mispalim Kfutzos. They daven in small groups like the Eze Kvarim Shebeicheres Kol HaKfutzos. The group chooses a kever and they daven in small groups. They divide them into three groups. As Tfilah Hanemeres Al Beis Alam B'Yem Ezeh. And in the Gesher Chaim he prints the tefillahs that are said on this day. And betfilah zeh mevakshim hachaverim gam slicha me'amesim. They ask mechila from the mesim. Pen chas v'shalom nikashlu b'i hanhagi yishar klapim mishu. Maybe they were noyig in a way that wasn't respectful enough, wasn't proper enough to a dead person. And then achakach he says mefakchin al asham al inyane beis alman k'en achanas tzarchi kfura. They do some work related stuff. And then in the afternoon, achar tzarayim, in the evening when the tainus is over, misasvim shuv kol chever kadisha lebeis hamedrash hagadol. They gather once more to the Beis HaKnesses HaGadol. Rav Gadol me'ashayachim l'chever kadisha derish l'fnei hakal, and a big Rav from the Chever Kadisha speaks in front of them. B'musar b'chlal u'me'inyana d'yayma v'chayvas haChever Kadisha b'frat, general musar and the chayva of the Chever Kadisha b'frat. B'mincha they say vayichal again. They lay in dirshu Hashem b'imatzah. They say anenu like every tainus. And be'erev that evening oisin suda gedayla b'shvil kol hachaverim u'b'sudas darshim machzikim zeh. And by the suda they give each other chizik, because the Chever Kadisha is a gory, it's a tough job. It's a job that's, I guess, easy to get burnt out of. So once a year, they have a very lofty day in the Chever Kadisha where they celebrate and they gather together. There's a little bit of kinship, a little bit of tainus, a little bit of tefillah, a little bit of bakashas mechila from the mesim. And there's many, many more minhagim of Chever Kadisha that are negay on Zayin Adar. But I'm sampling the Yerushalmi version that's described in the Gesher Chaim just because he describes it in detail. And Al Kapanim, this is another unique facet of Moshe Rabbeinu's Yartzeit. On Moshe Rabbeinu's Yartzeit, there was a uniqueness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the Chever Kadisha. So this was Nivchaz, the day of Chever Kadisha, because what more than to be Madami yourself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Chesed. Now, there's more minhagim, and in the Suda itself, there's many details in minhagim, but I think that's enough for one session. Thank you, Zagizan.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.